I died shivering in the rain, listening to my sister laugh over the phone as my family's empire crushed me. When I opened my eyes, it was 3 years earlier. Today they would disown me. This time, I just smiled, signed the papers, and bought the ground they walked on. The last sensation of my previous life was the paralyzing cold. I remember the deafening crunch of my Mercedes SUV wrapping around the concrete pillar on the FDR drive. I remember the taste of copper flooding my mouth, the agonizing pressure in my chest, and the relentless drumming of the New York rain against the shattered windshield. But more than the physical agony, I remember the glowing screen of my phone, resting upside down on the blood-soaked floorboard. The call had connected during the impact. Through the static and the sound of my own shallow, failing breath, I heard the crystal-clear chime of 2 champagne flutes clinking together. "Is it done?" That was my brother, Preston, his voice slurred with expensive scotch. "The police just called the estate," my mother, Caroline, replied. Her tone wasn't laced with the grief of a mother losing her eldest daughter. It was the relieved sigh of a CEO closing a difficult merger. The embezzlement scandal will die with her. The company is safe. "Good riddance," my sister Isabella giggled. And in the background, a deeper, familiar voice, Dominic, my fiancé, murmured his agreement. They had cut the brakes. My own family. The people I had sacrificed my youth, my sanity, and my happiness to protect. I bled out in the dark, framed for a $40 million corporate fraud I never committed, sacrificed so my golden boy brother could keep his trust fund, and so my sister could steal the man I was supposed to marry. Then the world went black. I woke up with a violently sudden gasp, my hands clawing at my chest. I expected to feel the slick warmth of my own blood and the shattered edges of my ribs. Instead, my fingers tangled in pristine, cool Egyptian cotton. I bolted upright, my heart hammering against my sternum like a trapped bird. I wasn't in the wreckage of a car. I was in my penthouse on Park Avenue. The morning sunlight was streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting golden, geometric shadows across the hardwood floor. Trembling, I reached for the Patek Philippe watch resting on the mahogany nightstand. I checked the date on the complication dial, October 14th. Not just any October 14th. I grabbed my phone, fully intact, no cracked screen, no blood, and stared at the year. It was exactly 3 years ago. I dragged myself out of bed and stumbled into the master bathroom, gripping the edges of the marble vanity. The woman staring back at me in the mirror was pale and visibly exhausted, but she was whole. There were no lacerations across her forehead, no glass embedded in her cheek. I traced the smooth skin of my face with a shaking hand. I had been reborn. A hysterical, breathy laugh escaped my lips, echoing off the cold tiles, October 14th. How could I ever forget this day? In my past life, this was the day of the infamous Carmichael Autumn Gala. This was the day my father, Harrison Carmichael, summoned me into his private study at the Waldorf Astoria and laid out the fabricated evidence of my incompetence. It was the day I was publicly humiliated, stripped of my position as COO of Carmichael Logistics, and effectively demoted to a meaningless shell company in the Midwest to take the fall for Preston's early gambling debts. In my first life, I had wept. I had fallen to my knees in that study, clutching the hem of my mother's designer gown, begging her to believe me. I had looked to Dominic for support, only to see him subtly step away from me, his eyes cold and distant. I had spent the next 3 years desperately trying to win back their affection, working from the shadows to fix the company's bleeding margins, only to be rewarded with a severed brake line when Preston's crimes grew too large to hide. I splashed freezing water on my face, letting it drip down my collarbone. The desperate, approval-seeking daughter who died on the FDR drive was gone. What remained in her place was something entirely different. A hollow, terrifying clarity. They didn't love me. They never had. I was simply the workhorse, the shield, and ultimately the sacrificial lamb. But there was one crucial detail my family didn't know. A detail I had foolishly surrendered to them in my past life out of a misguided sense of loyalty. My grandfather, Walter Carmichael, was the true founder of the empire. Before he passed away when I was 22, he saw exactly what Harrison was, a charismatic but deeply incompetent narcissist who would eventually run the family legacy into the ground. Grandfather didn't trust my father, and he certainly didn't trust Preston. When Grandfather died, the public will left the visible 60% of Carmichael Enterprises to my father, giving him the illusion of absolute control. But Grandfather had secretly established a shadow holding company in Delaware, Aegis Capital. Aegis held a web of senior secured debt, preferred shares with 10-to-1 voting rights, and the actual real estate deeds to every factory, warehouse, and corporate tower Carmichael Enterprises operated out of. Grandfather had left Aegis Capital entirely to me. He had left me the master keys to the empire, locked away in an encrypted trust until I turned 25. In my previous life, when the company hit a massive liquidity crisis just a month after this gala, I had panicked. Wanting to save my father's pride and the family name, I had quietly transferred the rights of Aegis Capital to Harrison, saving him from bankruptcy. He had patted me on the head, thanked me, and then systematically written me out of the company once he was secure. I looked up at my reflection. The water droplets on my face looked like tears, but my eyes were bone dry. "You want to disown me today, Harrison," I whispered to the empty room, a slow, dangerous smile creeping across my face. "I'll make it the easiest decision you ever made." The grand ballroom of the Waldorf Astoria smelled of white truffles, expensive orchids, and Wall Street hypocrisy. I stood near the edge of the room, holding a crystal flute of vintage Dom Perignon that I hadn't taken a single sip from. I wore a backless midnight blue Tom Ford gown that felt like a suit of armor. I watched the room with the detached amusement of a ghost attending its own funeral. Across the room, my father, Harrison, was holding court with a group of managing directors from Morgan Stanley. He looked the part of the billionaire patriarch, silver hair perfectly coiffed, a bespoke Savile Row suit, projecting absolute confidence. Beside him, my mother, Caroline, flashed her practiced icy smile, dripping in Cartier diamonds. And then there was Preston. My younger brother was loudly recounting a story about his recent yacht trip in Saint-Tropez to a group of sycophants. He was 24, held the title of executive vice president, and hadn't read a financial statement in his life. The $40 million deficit in the logistics division, the money he had siphoned into offshore accounts to cover his catastrophic losses in Macau, was the very crime they were about to pin on me. Audrey. I didn't flinch. I turned slowly to see Dominic approaching. He looked impossibly handsome in his tuxedo, his dark hair swept back. In my past life, my heart would have fluttered. Now, looking at the man who would one day listen to me die without a shred of remorse, I felt absolutely nothing. A cold, barren wasteland where my love for him used to be. Before he could reach me, Isabella slipped her arm through his. My younger sister, dressed in an angelic white Dior gown, looked up at him with doe eyes before turning her gaze to me. "Audrey, darling," Isabella purred, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "Dad is looking for you. He said he needs to speak with you in the private suite upstairs. It sounded urgent. She knew. She knew exactly what was about to happen. I could see the malicious glee dancing in her eyes, barely concealed beneath her innocent facade. "Of course," I said smoothly. My voice was steady, resonant. I didn't stammer. I didn't look at Dominic with pleading eyes. I simply set my untouched champagne glass on a passing waiter's tray. "Excuse me." I walked away without looking back, leaving them exchanging a brief, confused glance. The private suite on the 4th floor was stiflingly quiet. When I pushed the heavy oak double doors open, the atmosphere was thick with premeditated hostility. Harrison sat behind a massive mahogany desk. Caroline stood by the window, her arms crossed. Preston was leaning against a leather armchair, a smirk playing on his lips. "Close the door, Audrey," my father commanded. I closed it. I didn't sit down. I simply stood in the center of the Persian rug, perfectly poised, waiting. Harrison tossed a thick manila folder onto the desk. It landed with a heavy, damning thud. "I have just spent the last 2 hours on the phone with our internal auditors," he began, his voice dropping into the disappointed, authoritative register he reserved for reprimands. "It seems there is a catastrophic discrepancy in the logistics accounts. $40 million, Audrey. Vanished. Routed through shell companies that trace back to your departmental authorization codes." "I see," I said. 2 words, utterly devoid of emotion. Preston shifted uncomfortably. He had expected me to gasp, to deny it, to frantically demand to see the papers. "Don't play dumb, Audrey," Preston snapped, trying to project strength. "The digital footprint is everywhere. You've ruined the division." "See, the board meets on Monday," my father continued, his eyes narrowing at my lack of reaction. "If this gets out, our stock will plummet. The family name will be dragged through the mud. I cannot allow that." "So what is the solution you've devised, Father?" I asked, tilting my head slightly. My mother stepped forward, her face a mask of sorrow that didn't reach her eyes. "We have to protect the company, Audrey. We have to protect Preston and Isabella's futures. You've always been so volatile. The board will believe it was a mismanaged project, a rogue investment. But you have to step down immediately." Harrison slid a legal document across the desk. Next to it, he placed a heavy Mont Blanc fountain pen. "This is a resignation letter, effective immediately," Harrison said coldly, "and a transfer deed. You will relinquish your 15% visible equity in Carmichael Enterprises back to the family trust. In exchange, we will not press criminal charges. You will pack your things, vacate the penthouse by tomorrow morning, and you will move to the property in Ohio. You are cut off from the primary accounts. You are no longer acting as a Carmichael. In my past life, this was the moment my knees buckled. This was the moment I sobbed so hard I couldn't breathe, begging them to look at the IP addresses, begging them to realize Preston had stolen my passwords. I had fought tooth and nail, only to be beaten down by their unified front. This time, I looked down at the document. Then I looked at my father. I smiled. It wasn't a bitter smile, or a sad one. It was a genuine, radiant, terrifying smile. Preston's smirk vanished. My mother took a step back. Harrison's brow furrowed in deep, sudden confusion. "What is so funny, Audrey?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "Nothing, Father," I said softly. I walked over to the desk. I didn't bother reading the fabricated clauses. I picked up the Mont Blanc pen, uncapped it, and signed my name with a grand, sweeping flourish. Audrey Carmichael. I capped the pen and set it down precisely parallel to the document. "There," I said, my voice light, almost cheerful. "You have my resignation. You have my 15%. I will have my assistant send the penthouse keys to your office by midnight. Is there anything else? Silence. Suffocating, heavy silence filled the room. They had prepared for a war. They had prepared for tears, threats, and hysteria. My absolute, serene compliance threw them completely off balance. You're just signing it, Preston stammered, looking at the paper as if it might be poisoned. You caught me, Preston, I lied flawlessly, looking right into his panicked eyes. What else can I do? I turned on my heel and walked towards the door. Audrey, my father called out. For the first time in his life, he sounded uncertain. Where are you going? I'm disowned, Father, I said, pausing at the door and looking over my shoulder. I'm going to pack. I walked out of the suite, out of the Waldorf Astoria, and into the crisp October night. I didn't take the company car. I hailed a yellow cab, giving the driver the address to a 24-hour diner in Queens, far away from the glittering skyscrapers of Manhattan. As the cab sped over the Queensboro Bridge, I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called since my grandfather's funeral. It rang twice. Jonathan Pierce speaking. The gravelly voice of my grandfather's most trusted attorney answered. Jonathan, I said, watching the city lights blur past the window. It's Audrey. Audrey, he breathed, surprise coloring his tone. It's 11 p.m. on a Saturday. Is everything all right? Everything is perfect, I said, my reflection in the cab window smiling back at me. A predator finally realizing her strength. I need you to open the Aegis Capital vault. Execute the blind trust. And Jonathan? Yes, Audrey? Begin buying up the mezzanine debt of Apex Holdings, I instructed, naming the parent company that Harrison used to leverage his lifestyle. All of it. Whatever the distressed asset funds are holding, buy it at a premium. I want to own every single dollar Carmichael Enterprises owes. Audrey, that will trigger a massive margin call on your father within a year. You'll hold the collateral to everything they own. I know, I whispered into the phone, the sound of the rain starting to hit the taxi window, reminding me of a life I had left behind. I'm going to let them build their castles in the sky, Jonathan, and when they are at their highest, I am going to pull the earth out from under them. The following year was a masterclass in the art of vanishing. To the high society circles of Manhattan, Audrey Carmichael had simply ceased to exist. Rumors circulated that I was living in a dilapidated farmhouse in Ohio, battling a breakdown. My family, eager to solidify their narrative, confirmed these whispers with performative, tragic sighs at charity galas. In reality, I was operating out of a sleek, unmarked office on the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district, overseeing the monumental machinery of Aegis Capital. Jonathan Pierce and I moved with surgical precision. Over 12 months, we capitalized on my father's reckless desperation. Harrison, convinced he had excised the problem by disowning me, had given Preston total control over the logistics division's expansion. Predictably, Preston's idea of expansion involved catastrophic investments in volatile overseas shipping routes and funneling company funds to cover his spiraling private debts. To hide the bleeding, Harrison turned to the shadow banking sector. He took out massive, high-interest loans, using the Carmichael real estate portfolio as collateral. He thought he was dealing with faceless institutional creditors, entities like Oaktree Capital or Apollo Global Management. He had no idea that Aegis Capital was aggressively buying up those exact notes on the secondary market. I was the ghost in the machine. Every time Harrison Carmichael signed a distressed debt agreement, he was essentially handing a piece of his empire directly to me. By November, I owned 90% of their senior secured debt. I held the mortgage to the corporate headquarters. I held the deed to their Hamptons estate. I even held the financing notes on Preston's beloved 80-foot yacht, the Nautilus. I was sitting at my desk, reviewing a leverage report, when Jonathan walked in, a rare smile playing on his weathered face. "They've hit the wall, Audrey," Jonathan said, dropping a thick binder onto my desk. "The logistics division just posted a quarterly loss of 80 million. Your father is panicking. He's triggering the grace period clauses on the primary loans." And Jonathan paused, his eyes gleaming with professional satisfaction. "He is trying to leverage the family trust to secure an emergency bridge loan, the very trust you signed your 15% over to." "He's putting everything on black," I murmured, tracing the edge of the binder. "Exactly. And to keep up appearances, Caroline is throwing an exorbitant engagement party for Isabella and Dominic next weekend at the Plaza. They are spending millions they don't have to project strength to the board." I leaned back in my leather chair, letting the silence settle over the room. Dominic and Isabella, my former fiancée, and the sister who had giggled while I bled to death in my past life. They were celebrating their stolen happiness on the deck of a sinking ship. "Let them throw the party," I said smoothly, turning my gaze to the sprawling view of the Manhattan skyline. "Let them invite the board, the investors, the press. Let them stand on the grandest stage possible." "And the bridge loan?" Jonathan asked. "Deny it," I commanded, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. "Wait until the morning of the party. Then issue a formal margin call on all outstanding debt held by Aegis Capital. Call it all in, immediately. Audrey, if we do that, they won't have the liquidity to cover even 10% of it. The default clauses will activate. Aegis will legally absorb Carmichael Enterprises by Monday morning." "I know," I smiled, a predator watching the trap snap shut. "Order a new dress, Jonathan. We are going to a party." The grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel was a sea of crystal chandeliers, cascading white roses, and the elite vultures of New York society. I arrived an hour late, wearing a scarlet Valentino gown that moved like liquid fire, a stark, deliberate contrast to the sea of conservative black tuxedos and pastel silks. I slipped through the gilded doors unnoticed at first, lingering near the marble columns as the string quartet played a delicate waltz. I spotted them instantly. Harrison and Caroline were holding court near the main ice sculpture, projecting forced joviality. But the cracks were visible. My father's face was ashen, his smile tight and brittle. My mother kept glancing nervously at her phone. The margin call had been delivered at 9:00 a.m. They had spent the entire day frantically trying to reach the mysterious CEO of Aegis Capital, begging for an extension. In the center of the dance floor, Isabella and Dominic were spinning under the spotlight. Isabella wore a custom Vera Wang gown, radiating smug triumph. Dominic looked exactly as he had the night they betrayed me, handsome, hollow, and opportunistic. I waited until the music faded, and my father stepped up to the microphone to give his toast. "Friends, family, esteemed colleagues," Harrison began, his voice echoing through the opulent hall. He gripped the edges of the podium so hard his knuckles were white. "Tonight, we celebrate the union of my beautiful daughter, Isabella, and a man who has become like a son to me, Dominic. The Carmichael family has never been stronger." "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Harrison," I said. My voice wasn't a shout, but it was amplified by the acoustics of the ballroom, cutting through the silence like a diamond blade. The crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, dramatic aisle. Hundreds of eyes turned to me in shock. Whispers erupted like a sudden storm. "Audrey? The disgraced daughter? What is she doing here?" Isabella gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Dominic stiffened, his eyes widening in disbelief as he took in the woman I had become. No longer the exhausted, compliant victim, but a formidable force draped in red. Audrey. My father sputtered, his face turning an alarming shade of crimson. Security! Get her out of here! You have no right to be here! Actually, Harrison, I said, walking slowly, deliberately down the center of the ballroom, the click of my Louboutin heels echoing ominously. I have every right. I own the venue. The whispering stopped abruptly. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the room. "What are you talking about, you lunatic?" Preston snapped, stepping forward from the crowd, his face twisted in a sneer. "You don't own anything. You're a disgraced exile. You signed away your shares." "I signed away 15% of a visible shell," I corrected him, stopping just 10 feet from the podium. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "I signed away the debt-ridden facade that you, Preston, so graciously hollowed out to cover your $40 million gambling deficit in Macau, the deficit you framed me for." The board members in the crowd instantly went rigid. Murmurs of Macau? 40 million? Rippled through the investors. "Lies!" my mother shrieked, her composed facade shattering. "She is having a psychotic break. Escort her out." I ignored her, locking eyes with my father. At 9 o'clock this morning, Aegis Capital issued a comprehensive margin call on all of Carmichael Enterprises' leveraged assets. The grace period expired at 6 o'clock this evening. You failed to produce the capital. Harrison's knees visibly buckled. He clutched the podium, his breath coming in shallow gasps. How do you know about Aegis Capital? Only the Phantom Board knows." "There is no Phantom Board, Father," I said softly, but clearly enough for the front rows to hear. "There is only me." I signaled to Jonathan Pierce, who stepped out from the shadows near the entrance, holding a leather briefcase. He walked to my side and opened it, producing the official transfer deeds. "My grandfather knew exactly what you were, Harrison," I continued, my voice echoing with the weight of absolute victory. "He left the true holding company to me. Every loan you took out over the last year, you took from me. Every time you used our real estate as collateral, you handed it to me. I own the corporate towers. I own the shipping routes. I even own Preston's yacht." I turned to look at my brother, whose face had drained of all color. He looked like a terrified child, which, by the way, the authorities seized an hour ago for tax evasion. Preston staggered back, knocking over a tray of champagne glasses. The shattering crystal sounded like a gunshot in the silent room. I turned my gaze to Isabella and Dominic. My sister was trembling, tears streaking her perfect makeup. Dominic stepped away from her, his eyes darting frantically, realizing he had tethered his wagon to a dead horse. "You cut my brakes," I whispered, the memory of the rain and twisted metal flashing in my mind. No one else heard it, but Dominic saw my lips move. He saw the cold, murderous truth in my eyes, and he took another terrified step back. "As of this moment," I announced to the room at large, raising my voice, "Carmichael Enterprises is in default. Aegis Capital is executing a hostile takeover. Harrison, you and Preston are formally ousted from the board, pending federal investigation for embezzlement and wire fraud. The police are waiting in the lobby." My father collapsed, clutching his chest, sobbing into the mahogany podium. My mother fell to her knees beside him, wailing. Preston was already trying to bolt towards the kitchen doors, only to be intercepted by 2 massive security guards Jonathan had strategically placed. I stood amidst the ruins of my family, the people who had murdered me for their own greed. I looked at their tears, their panic, their absolute devastation, and for the first time in 2 lifetimes, I felt completely, perfectly at peace. I turned my back on them, walking out of the ballroom as the sirens began to wail in the distance, stepping into the cool New York night, ready to rule the empire that was always mine. Thank you so much for experiencing this incredible journey of betrayal and ultimate revenge. If Audrey's masterful comeback and tactical brilliance kept you on the edge of your seat, please hit that like button to show your support. Don't forget to share this thrilling story with your friends who love a jaw-dropping plot twist, and make sure to subscribe to our channel for more intense, dramatic, and unforgettable original audio stories. See you in the next video.